All right, well, it's been exciting to be here. It's I have been to UC Merced before, and it's great what you guys have been able to put together here. I'm going to be talking about work from a lot of people in my lab. In particular today, I'll talk about work from Tanya Yonker, who's now at Oculus, from Brendan Cohen-Chi, and from Zach Rea. I'm trying to think, there's other people who are in the lab I'll be talking about. I'll go through them as we go along, but I just want to make sure I give them credit so that every time I say I or we, you just substitute they and you think of them. So today I'm going to give, I wrote a brand new talk for you guys, so there's going to be quite a bit of preliminary data in here and things, so I hope you don't mind. It's not like as if this is all I have is unpublished preliminary data. It's actually, I just figured you guys might, you can read stuff that's on the internet, but this is the newest stuff. So, and part of what I wanted to kind of do is sell you on kind of the paradigm shift that I've had in my own research. So, one of the things that I've become fond of saying recently, you get older, you start to say the same things over and over. One of the things that I kind of wonder to myself is, are we actually studying what we think we're studying, or are we studying the way we study what we study? And so in memory research, the way we study what we study is this goes all the way back to Ebbinghaus. As Ebbinghaus did research on himself, and he gave himself these consonant-vowel consonant trigrams, which is very similar to what people do now, which is you give people a bunch of words, and then later on you might ask them to recognize them. Or you might show people faces, or you might show people objects. And you might ask them to make recognition judgments. Did you see this, yes or no? Or you can ask them to make recall judgments. So tell me all the things that you saw. And you can do all sorts of flavors of this, right? But this is the way we study memory. And I've spent most of my career doing this. And so the thing that's always bothered me is that one of the things that I've talked about throughout my career is that in order to understand memory, you can't think of memory in terms of words. You have to think about what I call context. And it's the stuff that's kind of the dark energy of memory that we don't study. I have a slide that I sometimes use in my talk where I have Ben Kenobi, and he talks about the force. And he says the force is this thing that permeates our existence. It's all around us. And that's basically what context is in these memory experiments. And so when people say, well, this is episodic memory. I had people study a bunch of words. And they say, somehow this is related to memory for events. And so, I started to get into, I've got a grant now to study this with collaborators, Ken Norman and Jeff Sachs and Sam Gershman. And one of the ideas behind this thing is we wanted to get at how people remember real events. And so, just as an example, I'm going to show you something. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, I want you to try to remember it and I'll ask you questions by the way. But just for kicks, I'll give you a secondary task too. This actually, I've tried it in 3 demos. It worked once and failed twice. So we'll see if you guys are going to be a more attentive audience. So part of what this is going to entail is I'll show you this segment of an episode of The Simpsons. And I want you to clap every time you feel like there's been a change in the events that are taking place. So in other words, something where you feel like the event has changed from one thing I was thinking about to another thing, okay? So basically just pay attention, just clap when you think something's changed. Don't worry if other people are clapping too. There's idiosyncrasies, everybody kind of has their own way of perceiving these things. Oh, shoot. Sorry about that. Yeah, okay, something changed. Okay, there we go.
Mayonnaise is starting to turn.
2 more feet and I can fit it in the fridge.
It's fine, really. I really think you should throw it away.
Suggestion noted. you alone with the sandwich for a moment?
You want to eat it?
Yes.
Oh, terrible.
I don't care. I'm going to Duff Garden. Oh,
Turning blue. I think you better stay home.
no! Don't go! Hurrah!
Okay, so I can actually show you this for the next hour for it's my favorite episode. But so it looks like the experiment worked actually, but now I'm gonna just ask one of you to try to recall this video. Anyone want to volunteer to recall it? All right, I'm gonna ask poor Carolyn since she's the one my host. So try to recall as much as you can from it.
Okay, so he's sleeping
Uh-huh.
March, and he wakes up in the morning because children are in the room, and then he wakes up and he goes to the park with his friend, and there's a sandwich, and he eats it, and then he goes home and goes back to bed, and they throw it away, and it's sick, and he's been sick, and he's been going to the hospital, and that's all I got.
Okay, so this is a perfect example of how people remember. And it was fairly, the way you produced it seemed fairly effortless. You had to put a little bit of work into it, but it wasn't that bad. It wasn't like what I would see in my typical experiments where I'm asking people to say this word. Now imagine if I had asked you to recall it and you said, dead, company, hoagie, suggestion, mayonnaise, fritz. I would say there's something seriously wrong with you. But this is what we ask people to do in memory experiments. And so the point here is that real events have structure. And I want to make this point clear because there's a lot of times in cognitive science, cognitive psychology, where people make a plea for ecological validity. And they go, this isn't like what we do in the real world, like as if that in and of itself is an argument to do it. That's not the argument I'm making today. I don't care about ecological validity. What I care about is studying what we think we're supposed to be studying. And what I feel like is, there's a saying that you don't see the forest for the trees. I feel like we're studying leaves in memory research, and what we need to do is step back and at least see the tree, if not the forest, right? And so this is where we're going, and I'm going to give you examples of this at different grain sizes, and some which are kind of more like the old way of doing things, and some which are more the new way, because we're making a transition in our own research. There's a second point which I had you guys do the other task, which is the clapping. And what that illustrated was that, there are certain points where some people thought there was a change, and those were kind of micro level events. And there are certain points where everybody clapped. And those were ones where people could go, there was a clear shift from one event to another. And the flashbacks were a good example of that. When he goes back and he imagines someone eating the sandwich, you can say, we've shifted the game from one event to another. To think about this, I have to kind of pull up a little new model in my head of what's going on. And that's what Jeff Zaks calls an event boundary. And I'll be talking more about event boundaries today, because I'll be talking about events. And so the idea is that to understand how we remember, you also have to kind of put in some assumptions, or at least try to attempt to understand how we represent events in the present, right? And part of the way that we need to think about this is that people are actively interpreting what's going on. They're making predictions about what's likely to happen. And at some point, you have to shift your model of the world to keep up with what's going on. And so, in today's talk, what I'll be describing are three kinds of phenomena today. So one is, I'm just going to ask, how is a complex event even represented in the brain? This is really preliminary data. I don't have a ton of it, but it does fit with a larger point that I want to make today. So sometimes it's like you got to go with whatever evidence you have to make a point. And I've actually got other evidence, but this is the most direct evidence I can show you. But the second thing I'm going to show you, and this is a little all over the place, but it relates to many of the things I want to talk about, is the phenomenon of, we think of memory sometimes, we talk about memory sometimes, as if you learn something and then you remember it later on. But in fact, what we find in a lot of memory paradigms is the act of remembering something changes it, right? So for instance, in your recollection, you remember that he went to the hospital. He actually didn't go to the hospital in the thing, but at the same time, the fact that you recalled that would make it much more likely that you will remember it that way later on. And what I'm going to talk about is how the way in which the brain reinstates past experiences can fundamentally change those memories in a positive way. And then the last part of the talk will be kind of putting this stuff together and saying, how does higher order structure, so for instance, like the structure of that Simpsons episode you watched, change the dynamics of memories over time? And these are things that we couldn't have studied without complex kinds of material. And by the way, I don't want to make the case that we're the first people to do this. Bartlett did this a long time ago. But the interesting thing is that a lot of Bartlett's work and subsequent work was about kind of how constructive memory is and how we use imagination and we use knowledge to reconstruct what's going on. What this is all about here is basically saying once we take event structure into account, how does that change the way we think about memory overall? So it's a slightly different take. Now, when people think about the brain, the first structure that they'll tend to think about in memory is the hippocampus. I won't go through all the details of this particular picture, but just to say that neuroscience research is focused on the hippocampus, and for the most part, we've solved some of the most basic problems. I think there's, of course, you can get, nobody will like to use anyone else's terminology or theories any more than they want to use their toothbrushes, but nonetheless, the basics are, everyone agrees that what the hippocampus seems to do is associate information about people and things with information about the context in which they're encountered. So for instance, your ability to remember this event later will not just depend on your ability to recognize my face or your ability to remember words that were spoken, but the ability to link everything that happened in this particular place and time. And another piece of information which most people agree upon is that the hippocampus is definitely needed to learn information that's specific to one event, like my lecture today, and that it's not needed to represent information that's just knowledge about the world that happened a long time ago, okay? So that's fine. And a lot of work from my lab has emphasized the role of the hippocampus in the temporal organization of memory. So remember, I was saying that if you need a hippocampus to tell you about an event, well, what makes an event unique to some extent is the fact that it happened at a particular place and time. And you can have similar events like other people's lectures about memory in this very room, but they won't be exactly the same. And to your brain, what makes it different is not any one of the individual pieces, but the fact that they all came together in your brain at one particular segment of time. And we've done a lot of work, but this is not just my lab. There's lots of labs that are doing work to say that episodic memory is organized by time and that hippocampal representations are organized by time. And that's not to say that time is the only factor, but time, space, and situation, or the where, when, and how, seem to be very high on the list, and who or what seems to be very low on the list. But wait, there's more to it. So it's not just like, so a lot of people will stop and give you an hour-long lecture on the hippocampus. But one of the things that I've been very interested in is that if the hippocampus is playing this tiny role in really telling you what happened, where, who was in a particular event, there's got to be something more to the story, right? Because our memories are often richer than that. And your memory of the cartoon was a great example. And so one of the things that we've become very aware of through imaging, actually, although you can go back into the anatomy literature and you can go back in other literatures and find hints of this, is the idea that there isn't just the hippocampus kind of working as an independent module, but in fact that it has a rich set of anatomical connection. And even though it's a rich set of anatomical connections, it's not connected with everything in the way we think it is, right? So the meaningful interactions with the hippocampus, there are probably more than two networks, but one of the things that we've emphasized in our work is there's at least two networks that seem to be involved. And we've been really interested in the idea that there's this network that we call the posterior medial network. I'll talk about this a little bit more, but the basic idea is if you analyze the connections of the hippocampus, what you'll find is that there's a massive amount of connections, especially with the medial entorhinal cortex, with these areas that are kind of in the back of the brain, mostly middle part of the brain, like what some people will call the default network, the retrosplenial cortex, parahippocampal cortex. Interestingly, as I'll talk about in a little bit, these areas are, if you study rats and the hippocampus, you'll know this as areas that you'd call it the spatial navigation system. A lot of other people, as I'll talk about, will think of it in completely different contexts, and I'll try to give you a story of what I think it is. This network, on the other hand, are more lateral regions, but areas of the frontal cortex and ventral temporal cortex and parietal cortex seem to be a different anatomical net. And what's key is that these areas are all highly interconnected with each other. And these areas are all highly interconnected with each other. And so why is that important? Now, this is actually an old diagram that I pulled off the internet of voting relationships between senators. And so basically, this was, like I said, it's old because I think probably now you just have a complete bisection of these networks. But basically, the idea is that people within one political party would often tend to vote along with each other. But if you wanted to get some kind of cooperation, you'd have to go through a couple of people, Susan Collins and Murkow, or a couple there that are still kind of the swing votes in a lot of ways. But basically, if these two got voted out, you'd have a complete disconnection, right? So in other words, you could lose any of these people and any of these people, and you'd still have party affiliations, but you'd still have some crosstalk between the parties. But if you were to lose these two, now you get a large degree of disconnection and massive dysfunction in this voting network, right? Well, the brain's the same way. And in fact, that's probably why these areas in the medial temporal lobe are so important for memory. Because if you have information represented within these networks, you can get by for communication within these networks just fine. But you're producing a massive disconnection if you were to have damage to the hippocampus and other areas around it. Why that's important is because it's not saying that memory is localized in these areas, but rather memory emerges through this interaction across these different networks. And by losing the hippocampus, you lose that ability to be able to essentially plug in what happened at a particular place in time into these networks. And so I think of memory not in terms of being localized in one place, but we can think of different sort of specializations in some sense, at least at the network level. So here's just a picture using functional connectivity as one way of doing it. So this is where you look at correlations in bolt signal, and what you find is again, you can find evidence for this network that I call the posterior medial network, and this network that we're calling the anterior temporal network. Now, this is just a plug for some stuff I did in collaboration with a student at UC Santa Cruz. We were able to actually find evidence for this posterior medial network in the sea lion brain. So it seems to be pretty conserved, at least across mammals. So one of the interesting things, though, that's been found in many, many studies is that this posterior medial network shows all sorts of activity during episodic memory tasks. So this was actually an old study that I did back in, we published it in 2005. And in this study, I didn't even realize it at the time, but basically these are all areas that showed increases in connectivity with the hippocampus when people learned something successfully. And what you can see is all of these regions in the PM network were showing enhanced connectivity when people successfully learn. When you look at just overall activity, when people remember a past event, I can tell you I remember something about where, when, and how, you get activity through the same network. So I could stop here and tell you, well, this posterior medial network is just a memory network, right? But it turns out it's doing so much more than that. So you can ask people, let's say, to virtually navigate in an MRI scanner. You get activation throughout this network. You can ask people to remember an event from their lives, which is pretty similar to recollection in these lab tests, and you get the same network shown. You can also show people an object that tends to be seen in particular contexts, like for instance, a bowling pin. You're not likely to see a bowling pin in places other than a bowling alley, right? Turns out you activate that same network. You can have people do a whole lot of high-level cognition tests from moral decision-making to planning for the future. You activate the same network. Interestingly, if you ask people to just listen to a narrative and understand what's going on, you activate the same network. And this is a brand new study. It's not actually published yet, but it's from Ken Norman and Chris Baldessano and Uri Hassan. And what they did was they showed people different kinds of movies. So they're just watching a movie. And each of these movies, I think one of them was the movie, I think Catch Me If You Can. I can't remember what the other one was. But they involved the same sequence of events, which was entering an airport, going through airport security, and then boarding the gate. And what they found was if you looked within the posterior medial network, there's a particular characteristic pattern of activity that they saw when people were entering an airport. And this is the pattern of activity you see across two different movies while people were entering the airport. when they hit an event boundary, and now they're at airport security, you see a complete shift in the patterns. But it generalizes across these two movies with airport security. And when you look at their boarding, again, you see a shift in the patterns, but it's reliable across both movies. So this is not event specific, right? Because these are two different movies. People are very aware that they're two different movies. It's not like they don't know the difference. And yet there's something that the posterior medial network is signaling that's conserved across these two different movies. So there's a lot of different aspects of what could be going on in the PM network that I think are interesting. But one of the ideas that we came up with is this idea that what the posterior medial network doing isn't just pure sensory processing, and it's not pure episodic memory processing. It's something more like it's extracting some knowledge about the world. And so we borrowed from the language literature, and we brought up a concept called situation models. And the idea is if you're reading a paragraph of text, you're not going word by word, but rather you're constructing a little mental representation of what's going on. And that mental representation allows you to make interpretations in real time and even make predictions about what's likely to happen at a very high level time scale. And so for instance, if you were watching a movie with these scenes in it, you might be able to pull out a relationship between these characters and what they're doing and the sequence of events that's likely to take place. And you could be here and use your everyday clairvoyance to predict what's likely to happen up here and make some reasonable predictions of what's likely to happen. And this information can be informed by sensory cues like scene information. It can be informed by temporal cues. So for instance, if you have this event and then this event and then they're looking at the movie theater, they're likely to go into that building, right? Just from seeing those first few scenes. And so this is a kind of knowledge of the world that we would argue it forms kind of this dark energy in our memories, right? In other words, if you had never heard of a cafe or been to a cafe before, your ability to remember something that happened in a cafe would probably be different than if you have that knowledge, right? I mean, when you remember an event that took place in a cafe, you don't have to think about what the barista is doing or, you know, the fact that you had to pay for something at the cash register. These are all just things that are going on in the background. And you're just attaching little details to it that occurred at a particular place in time. Now, we argued this isn't everything. So you can take two different movies, for instance, that have different characters and still get overlapping representations in the PM network. But we also have mental representations of people and things. And so we hypothesized that that's what this anterior temporal network is giving us. It's not knowledge about time, place, and situation. It's knowledge about people and things. So you have the who and what information and the where, when, and how information. And these are two basic components of our memories, but they seem to be supported by different networks. And so just as kind of a proof of concept, we have other data that's consistent with this, but this is the coolest data that I wanted to show you. My postdoc, Zach Rea, did a study. This is still preliminary data, but the effect sizes, and one of the things we came out of this is we should do lots of experiments with movies because the effect sizes are unlike anything I've ever seen. I mean, if nothing else, I want to move towards naturalistic memory studies because they just give us much larger effects. But what we did was we just tested a very simple idea, which is that the posterior medial network should represent information online and in memory about places, situations, and so forth, whereas the AT network should represent information about people. And so what we did was we gave people, had people watch two movies. I think do I have the movies here? Here's some video clips so you can see them. You don't need sound for those, but this is my postdoc Kameen, by the way. We kept everything cheap. It was all free acting labor. Don't call it Screen Actors Guild. Okay, so anyway, this is not the most exciting video, so we'll move on to the next one too. So anyway, you get the idea. So here's two parallel movies. They both occur in the same spatial context. They're both occurring at this cafe in Davis called Mishka's. And they're doing different things, they're different people, but for the most part, the context is the same. We had people watch these movies in the scanner. They also watch movies where Kameen and Alex are in a different cafe, where Kameen and Alex are in two different grocery stores. So we cross people with different classes of context and within different specific context to be able to see what's being represented in real time by the brain as people learn, and also what's happening when people recall those events. Now, we don't have the data yet on recall, but one of the things we've seen in other data, and our collaborators, Ken Norman and Marie Hassan and Chris Paulson have seen this too, is that when people recall these events from movies, you see a recapitulation of the same sequence of brain patterns in the posterior medial network as people recall the event as they do when they watch them. But here what we're interested in is getting a better idea of what is being represented. And so what we found is, this is just really preliminary, but the effect sizes are fairly large for the number of subjects we have in it. So I do feel good about showing it to you. Is that what we did in this study is we wanted to do something which is analogous to what I showed you with the study where they look at the brain patterns when people are looking at two different versions of going through airport security. And what I'm quantifying here is the similarity in the neural patterns across two different movies. And so you can look at two different movies that occurred in Mishka's, two different movies that occurred in two different cafes, or two movies that were occurring in two different places altogether, like the supermarket versus this particular cafe. And you can look at movies that involve the same person and movies that involve a different person. And so what we see in these areas of the posterior medial network is representation of the context information, meaning there are fairly stable patterns of activity when people are watching two different movies that are in the same place. And the precuneus even seems to generalize so that patterns of activity across related contexts, like two different cafes, are generalizing as well. Now, one of the things you could very easily say is, as people are watching a movie, a lot of that visual information is captured by the scene information, right? So maybe this is just visual similarity, but one of the things you can ask is, well, there's these clearly visual areas of the brain in the temporal lobe that should be involved in representing this spatial information. But in fact, what they're showing is higher similarity across anything that involves the same character. But anything that involves different characters, even if the spatial context is the same, the pattern similarity is lower. And so we're seeing this in the perironal cortex and the temporal pole. These are areas in the temporal network. Now this is super preliminary, but it's still evidence at least to suggest that our brains are extracting in real time differences across the same, you're getting the same information content. It's not like I'm comparing faces and scenes or something like that, but it's being split up in real time by these different networks. And the hippocampus, on the other hand, seems to represent this episode-specific information. So you change any of the variables and you don't get nearly as high similarity as you get two repetitions of the same movie. So now you're getting the information about the context, and information about the people and things, and the combination of the two in the hippocampus. Interestingly, in the prefrontal cortex, we also see context representation, but it's completely generalizing across different cafes. So it doesn't care about which cafe you're at, it cares about, here's a class of places, presumably where you can do different kinds of things. And so we're again seeing a different kind of information that's being extracted from these movies. And so the point I wanted to make is, first of all, just as a proof of concept, it makes sense to look in these different networks. And just, I don't think I mentioned this, but one of the reasons why it makes sense to look in these networks is areas in all these regions are highly interconnected with each other, which means if you have some information that's going in here, it will spread throughout this network. And so we've seen over and over again is, when we look at information about neural representations, they seem to be conserved within a network, but they seem to differ, just like in the examples I showed you, across different networks. So I'm going to, now that I've kind of hopefully convinced you that it makes sense to look at different networks, I'll try to explain why this is useful in thinking about memory. So one of the findings that we've known for a while now is, in memory research, is the act of remembering itself changes your memory for an event. And so Henry Roediger, or Roddy as we like to call him, is really famous for this work. And so he studied something called the retrieval practice effect, or the testing effect. And the simple idea, which is actually, we've used it, I use it now in my memory class all the time, is that testing people is the best way to get people to learn material. And so, but it's not actually learning that actually benefits. So you can test people on material that they need to learn, or you can just have them repeatedly study it. And so as it turns out, if you have people just study information over and over, or if you have them study it and then test them on it, what you find is immediately you don't get any significant difference, or sometimes people can be better at remembering things if they just studied it over and over again. But if you wait, you get a dramatic enhancement in retention if you test people over and over again. Now this is, as a memory researcher, it took me a while to appreciate this, but once I figured it out, this is a phenomenal finding, because basically what you're seeing is equal learning, but completely different retention curves, which there's very few things. I mean, if I were to say to you right now, you can ask people this. If you study things over and over, you ask people, what's the likelihood that you'll remember it next week? They'll think it's probably just as good if you studied it over and over again versus testing. As it turns out, testing is really much more useful for retention. So that's just an applied thing. If nothing else, you can take away from that for your teaching. But what I think is interesting about this is that there's something that's happening after the learning period. And so some people talk about this process that's taking place is called consolidation. And one phenomenon that seems to be particularly relevant is the phenomenon of what's called reconsolidation. Now, I can't make strong claims about consolidation or reconsolidation, but there's a basic phenomenon which has been shown over and over again in memory research in different contexts. Like Beth Loftus has shown this in her studies of constructive memory, where you can learn something and retrieve information about that event. And actually what seems to happen is that the memory can be modulated during that time. And so new information can be incorporated and the memory can be updated, or the memory could be strengthened or weakened depending on what happens shortly after retrieval. This has been shown in animal models, and you can do, for instance, introduce protein synthesis inhibitors that basically kill the memory, or you can modulate and enhance the memory if you do things right after an animal retrieves the memory. But it has to happen within a short window of time after a memory is accessed. And so one possibility is at least one component of these retrieval practice effects is that when you activate a memory, now all of a sudden it becomes vulnerable to all sorts of things that can happen. And if nothing else, if you recall the information, you can actually potentially strengthen it and strengthen your ability to retain it for a long period of time. But this is a time-dependent process, and so you have to kind of measure it a little bit after the fact. So my postdoc, Tanya, did a study where what she wanted to know is, okay, well, testing effect is typically studied in these simple list memory paradigms. Like I give you some words in Swahili, and I want you to learn the definitions of these things. But we wanted to know, A, can this happen in more real-life events? And B, if you do that, what is remembering one aspect of a memory, what effect does that have on the rest of the memory, right? So in other words, if our memory is organized not in terms of little bits and pieces that we've been studying, like words on a list, but in these cohesive events, does remembering one piece of an event help you retain other pieces that you didn't actively recall, right? And so we started off with a simple, boring list learning paradigm, but we introduced at least some degree of structure to it. And so what we did was we showed people these scenes, like, here's an alley, and we asked people, okay, imagine this paint roller in the alley, and now imagine this cat in the alley. So what happens is the scene stays on the screen, and these objects are popping up, and people are imagining them. But periodically, we change the scene, and so what happens is when you kind of go from one scene to another is you hit an event boundary, and people mentally feel the context change. They're aware that something has changed, obviously. And so for each of these scenes that we show, we pair them with different objects. And for half of the scenes, we'll either have them do retrieval practice, so they'll retrieve right after they learn the kitten goes in the alley. They'll basically be asked, here's the alley. Do you remember something that started with a K that went with this alley? And people will recall the kitten. Or we'll show people a scene and we'll actually have them study watch over again. That's it, right? And so what we're interested in, first of all, is in this kind of a much more simple memory paradigm where there's no semantic knowledge that's really giving you much help. Does retrieval practice help you retain this information one day later relative to restudying the information? And we do that by giving people the scenes and we show them just the first letter and we ask them to regurgitate what they saw. Does that make sense to everyone? So that's the basic paradigm. But what we also did was we tested people on stuff that they didn't retrieve. And so what we can ask is, first of all, does retrieving information help you retain information better? But second, we can see, does retrieving something about the kitten spill over to the paint roller because it's part of the same event? If so, then we can say that what people are doing is they're not just reinstating their memory for this little thing, but they're actually reinstating this larger episode that's taking place. So in this experiment, first of all, we replicated the testing effect. So that was nice because it's a very different kind of approach to doing it. But we still found in both a behavioral experiment and in our fMRI experiment that we could get this effect. So there's no replication crisis averted. And so the next question we could ask is what's happening in the brain while people are doing this retrieval practice or study effect? Now, as I mentioned, the typical approach in fMRI is you just look at the average level of activity while people are retrieving information. And this ignores the fact that activity varies from trial to trial. And so what we do is instead we can look, say, in the hippocampus and get a little chunk of voxels. And when we look at these voxels, actually the variability from trial to trial is much larger than the actual amount that's stable and preserved from trial to trial. And that actually carries some information to it. So for instance, if we were to, actually I'll just say very quickly that one voxel contains lots and lots of neurons. If we imagine these neurons actually are not just the neurons themselves, but actually we're sampling from the vasculature that's feeding those neurons, so to speak, via the astrocytes. It's a complex metabolic chain that leads to something that we get in fMRI. But the point is that we're sampling from large populations of neurons. So we can do something that's very simple, that's very related to what people in systems neuroscience have been doing for some time, which is in systems neuroscience, they'll say, well, we don't care necessarily if we get more neurons firing in condition A than condition B. What we want to know is the neural population telling us something about what the animal is remembering? So for instance, we don't care if more place cells fire when I'm here versus I'm there. What we care about is, do the place cells tell me some information about where I am? And so for instance, you could look at, this is just a cartoon diagram of two neurons. So basically, you can look and say, well, there's more firing here for the, neuron A fires a lot when you see this rabbit, neuron B doesn't, but neuron B fires a lot when you see this wren. But what's more interesting is that if you actually look across this two-dimensional space, you can see that the firing rates are more similar for these two animate objects than this inanimate object. And so we could, yes?
So you have like this voxel score per trial. Is that only one scene per trial?
That's right. That's exactly right. You're anticipating where I'm going with this, but that's absolutely right. So we can substitute neurons for voxels here. And so we can actually compare the patterns of activity rather than looking at just the magnitude average across voxels. We can look at the pattern of activity in individual trials and compare that similarity. But when we're talking about a chunk of voxels, it's not just a two-dimensional space. It's a pretty large dimensional space. And so what we can do is we can estimate activity on every trial, and we can use a Pearson's R basically as our metric of similarity. So it's just, you could just as easily use Euclidean distance or other metrics, but these are just basically saying how similar is the neural pattern when people are remembering these two events. And so what we did was we looked during retrieval practice and restudy, and we can compare, let's say here, I'm comparing the pattern of activity in the hippocampus and in other regions while they're practicing watch to the activity pattern we got when they studied watch, or the pattern of activity when they recalled the kitten to the pattern of activity when they studied kitten. The more similar these patterns are, the more we can say they've reinstated that study event, so to speak. Now that's a basic assumption here, but if the assumption didn't work, this experiment would go south. So that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to see, are people doing a better job of reinstating that episode during the retrieval practice than they were during restudy when they're just seeing this as, potentially seeing this as a new event. Now, it's a counterintuitive prediction because you might expect the other way around. You might expect restudying should be more similar than actually going back and actively having to retrieve it. But that's what we expected if what people are doing is they're not just re-encoding this thing, but rather they're retrieving a past event. So our prediction was that during retrieval practice, we'd see higher pattern similarity than during restudy. Getting kind of slow here. And so what we found was that doing retrieval practice actually reinstated the pattern of activity to a greater degree in the hippocampus and the posterior medial network. So in both the hippocampus and the posterior medial network, the act of retrieving that past event elicited a pattern of activity that was very similar to what happened during the study phase, or at least more similar than when you're restudying the same information. We don't see this in the anterior temporal network, so it's specific, at least reasonably specific. It's not happening everywhere, but it's happening in the network of areas that we think should be involved in episodic retrieval. So this is fine. So we get this testing effect, and it seems to be related to people's ability to reinstate what happened during the study phase. So what about, do we get spillover, behaviorally, first of all? Does retrieving something about the kitten improve my memory for the paint roller association? And in fact, we do get it. Again, no replication crisis, 2 experiments, and actually we've got other experiments that I'll skip over for the sake of time, but we've replicated this effect in other studies too. So the act of retrieving information about one thing helps you retain information about stuff that you weren't even actively retrieving if the context was the same. And so somehow I lost the slide. Damn it. Somehow I lost the slide, but basically, unfortunately, it's like I lost the slide that was the punchline to this because it looks exactly like this slide, and so I thought I had duplicates. But the basic gist of it is, go back to this. That's the slide. So in the anterior temporal network, again, we don't see any neural spillover effect, and we don't see it in the hippocampus, but we do see it in the posterior medial network. So the hippocampus seems to be kind of saying, hey, go back to this episode. But then the PM network seems to be unfolding it, so it gives you not only something that's similar to what happened when you recall that target item, when you learned that target item, but something that's broader, it's extending across the episode. Does that make sense to everyone? So, having established that, I'll skip over this stuff really quickly. Does anybody here care about retrieval-induced forgetting? Okay, so I'll briefly just say this. So my postdoc, Xiaodan Liu, had done a study saying, why is it that retrieval can enhance memory? Because other people have shown that retrieving some information can actually impair memory for related information. And so what we figured was, well, maybe it depends on whether you're looking within an episode versus across episodes. So in other words, retrieving information about item A can help you from help you retain information from this other stuff from the same event as when you learned item A. But it should hurt your ability to retain other stuff about another event that's completely different. In other words, if memory is organized by events and not by items, then we should be able to see both retrieval-induced forgetting, which is a competition between accessing one memory and another, and this retrieval-induced enhancement, which is the effect of retrieving one thing on other things that are part of the same event. Just to make a long story shorter, we actually find both effects in the same experiment. So we can, retrieving, let's say, information, I'll show it to you here very quickly. So basically, I'll just show you the short delay data for now, but basically, if you have things that are adjacent to each other, actually I'll show you both. If you have things that are part of the same event or they're close together in time, you get a spillover effect, meaning that you do better for having been tested on it than for not having been tested on it. But you get the classic retrieval-induced forgetting effect if things were far apart in time. So they can be related to each other in terms of sharing the same scene content, but if they're studied at different points in time, you get competition. If they were linked together as part of the same event, in other words, if you didn't have an event boundary, you'd actually get a facilitation. Question?
Just a real quick question on clarification. When you're talking about larger timescales and shorter timescales, what's the general timescale there? Seconds, days?
Yeah, no, it's definitely, so, well, there's different timescales I'm talking about. So one timescale I'm talking about is the timescale between two things in the study phase. And so they're really, so in other words, in our particular experiment, you had seen those on the screen and you get object, same scene shows up, you get another object. So that's like seconds, right? Versus another scene shows up and another object, and they could be separated by, you know, a few trials, so maybe like 1 minute, or separated by many trials, like, you know, several minutes. And so it turns out that you get the big, you get when they're close in time but separated by an event boundary, or far in time and they're separated by an event boundary, you get the retrieval-induced forgetting effect. Now it turns out if you test people after a long interval, you can start to get links between things that were studied far apart in time if they share the same, if they're related to each other, if the item information is related to each other and they share the same content. This is something I'll come back to later. So yeah, it's a good question. The temporal scales have a really interesting role to play in a lot of these phenomena. So I'm sorry if I'm kind of all over the place. I had to get up kind of early to drive here. So, but everything I've showed you so far, you might go, well, hey, Ranganath, you showed me this movie of a Simpsons episode, and now you're showing me a bunch of stuff with this. So does any of this apply to actually a complex real event? And so to do this, Tanya and I came up with an approach where we equipped people with wearable cameras. And we created a learning experience where people go to the California Raptor Center where we rescue birds of prey. And what we did was we asked people to go ahead and try to, what they would do is they would go sit in this tour and they would learn information about different birds of prey. They see different birds, and all the time their wearable cameras are snapping pictures of them. Now, as it turns out, most of the pictures are pictures of the floor, pictures of people's hands, pictures of the ceiling, or just blurred out crap. But what we did was every subject's camera, after they were done with the tour, we had a team of RAs go through and scrub these cameras to get the best pictures we could, and then link them to particular things that were happening at different points during the lecture. And so what we can do is we could do a retrieval practice or restudy manipulation, but on a real life event that people experience. So they come back to the lab one day later, and one group gets retrieval practice where they showed a picture and they were asked, okay, what was the fact that you learned when this took place? Another group does exactly what my daughter might do, which is she'd look through her Snapchat feed, oh, that's a terrible picture, delete, or oh, that's a great picture, and send it to my friends, or something. So people were judging the pictures, but they weren't actually using it as a retrieval cue. And the bottom line is that, oh, and then later on, 1 week later, they're tested on memory for the facts they practiced and the ones they didn't. So real life complex events are sitting there, 1 week retention interval, and we test them on the practiced and the non-practiced facts. And what we found was real life events benefit from retrieval practice, and you get a spillover to stuff that people didn't retrieve actively during the retrieval practice phase. So, you know, one thing you can say to this is, well, okay, this is kind of stupid because basically the retrieval practice group is doing retrieval practice and you're testing them with retrieval, so it makes sense that they can remember more. Turns out, though, one of the weird things about this paradigm is every subject gets different photos. And it turns out the photos that you give people are pretty critical here. And so our effect was actually kind of weak. So we went back and we showed people a movie of the lecture. And we asked people in a completely different group to rate event boundaries, just like you guys did where you were clapping during the movie, the Simpsons clips. And then we asked, how much of a spillover do you get between what you recall during retrieval practice versus other things where they were separated by an event boundary? And it turns out that basically, forget about the ambiguous, if you look at clearly things that were related to each other, what you can see is the more event boundary, the greater the likelihood of an event boundary, the less spillover there was. So this really seems to suggest that event organization is playing a significant role, because retrieving one piece of information helps you retain other information if it's conceived as part of the same event. But if you perceive it as part of a different event, you don't get any benefit, and sometimes you can even get a little bit of a cost, which is exactly what we found in the lab paradigm. So that's a part of the story. But things get more interesting when they look at even a higher level, right? Because I showed you this episode of The Simpsons. I only showed you part of it. This is a set of scenes from that entire episode, right? And so at some point, you reach the end of this episode, and basically to make sense of what happens now, you have to go back and retrieve all of these little side plots later on and link it up to kind of come up with some kind of a story about what happened, right? So this is something we do in real life, is that our experiences have a higher order structure to it. And so we wanted to create an experiment to see, well, given that retrieval practice influences people's ability to retain information, even about things that they weren't actively retrieving, what happens if you look at online experience? In other words, if you have to go back and retrieve something and be able to make sense of what's happening now, maybe that's going to affect memory consolidation as well. And so my student Brendan Cohen-Sheedy did a study in which we had people learn stories. And so these are complex narratives that he wrote. They're kind of like, they involve protagonists. The protagonist is doing a bunch of stuff. But we call this the Kramer experiment, because if you ever watched the TV show Seinfeld back in the day, there would be a main plot with Jerry, and then Kramer would periodically fly through the door. Something would happen, and then 5 minutes later, something else happens with the same character. And so in this paradigm, we had two stories, and periodically there would be a side plot that involves one of the event, that involves one character. And so in one case, the side plot from story 1 and story 2 fit together to make one big narrative. So for instance, a coherent side plot could be I left my oven on and I couldn't find my keys, and luckily the fire department had a spare key. So from this, you can basically infer what happened. This guy left his keys and he left the oven on and his apartment caught on fire, but the fire department saved him, right? To understand what's going on here, it really helps to recall that event. In the incoherent case, they get two completely different narratives, but both involving the same character. So we test people then immediately after the study phase in one group. Another group gets tested at a 24-hour delay period. Now, you might expect that people would just show better memory for the coherent events in general than the incoherent events. But at an immediate test, that's not what we see. People's ability to retain that information is completely the same. Now this, what I'm about to show you, when I saw this, I went, so you guys might not do it. As a memory researcher, this is a mind-blowing data point. Not only do people show a significant difference between coherent and incoherent events at the long delay, they're actually reporting more information at the 24-hour delay than the group that was tested immediately. Now, I don't have a great, I would never have predicted this, but it does rule out a whole lot of crazy explanations that you could say that would be confounding. There seems to be something that's going on during this delay that seems to be stitching everything together into a higher order narrative. And this is something a lot of people report to us. They'll say, well, yeah, after I go, after a memory gets older, I lose the details and it becomes more of a story than I tell to myself. And what seems to be happening is that in fact there does seem to be some reorganization of information over time that allows you to remember more of the memory. But we haven't tested this, but my guess is you're remembering different stuff. You're remembering plot elements as opposed to these surface level details. So basically our conclusion here is that, how does event structure influence memory? Well, our data suggests that the hippocampus is linking information about particular people and things to a particular event context. But to really fully understand the memory story, you have to go out of the hippocampus and understand what the posterior medial network is doing, which seems to be integrating information that spans the course of an event. And that reactivation of an event representation doesn't just help you remember one piece of information. It seems to remember other things that help you remember other things that are part of the same event. Now, the critical part of this is if you were just thinking about memory in terms of these little bits and pieces, you wouldn't be able to get that story. So if there's nothing else you take away from this, it's that structure seems to matter. Structure seems to matter at the event level and even at the higher order narrative level. And so these are things that memory researchers need to account for. It's not just a matter of ecological validity. It's a phenomenon that needs to be studied. And so temporal structure, event structure seem to be playing an important role in both behavior and in terms of the brain systems that we think support episodic memory. So I know I've talked a lot, I've talked fast, but hopefully you'll remember this. Thank you for your attention.
So for the first 15 minutes, we'll do students from questions, and then we'll move over to anyone else.
Just a reminder, what was the length of the scenes on those trials?
Oh, God. Dude, this is why postdocs should present their own research and the faculty members who sat around like, you should do it this way. If I remember correct, it was probably something on the order of, during the experiment, I think it would be something like 2 seconds on and like probably 4 seconds off between trials.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think we varied slightly the intertrial interval between things to be able to slightly separate the response to one versus the other. But the important thing was the average interval between events was precisely matched between the retrieval practice and the restudy items, so you didn't have any differential confound there.
Stupid question. Are these activations in the PMAT networks, are they lateralized to one hemisphere?
It's a good question. So in the data that I showed you, they were averaged across hemispheres. We often get, if you do RS analyses, representational similarity analysis, we will often see, especially in the hippocampus more than other areas, effects that are, but often in other areas too, where we look across many areas and it'll be carried more by one hemisphere than the other. I have never been able to explain those findings. There seems to be no rhyme or reason for it. Within the hippocampus too, sometimes it's carried entirely by the posterior, sometimes it's carried entirely by the anterior. But we don't have a good explanation for it. I mean, unfortunately, you know, it's kind of funny how these things go, like, you know, in research you tend to get these cycles like fashion. And so it's like, before I started doing imaging, if you were interested in the brain, you studied laterality. And there's this mountain of research on it. Then once imaging came along, there's this paradigm shift and everybody dumped laterality studies and we're doing these localization studies. But the thing is that fMRI is a lousy tool for studying laterality because you'll often get much more bilateral activation than really it kind of under characterizes the asymmetry. So I don't know, it's not a bad question at all, but I don't know what it means. But in these particular studies, it didn't matter, but you'll often see these differences.
Morning.
So I wonder how we can ground the distinction between context and not context. I was reading one of your recent papers and you made the point that stimuli in the world doesn't come with labels attached to it. You know, contexts are also objects and people. So what is it really in the brain that distinguishes those two pathways of information? Is it a visual and a temporal distinction? That context is more of the temporal episode, or I don't know, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think, you know, I'll get into arguments with people, and part of the problem is that people want to come up with a hard and fast rule. This is an item, this is a context, right? And they'll do the same thing. They'll say, well, this is an object, this is a scene, right? You know, but I can show you like a swarm of bees, and you could say, well, that's a scene, or you could say that's an item, depending on the scale in which you're looking. And so, so getting back to this idea of items and content, I think the brain uses multiple cues. So just getting back to the objects and scenes, as it turns out, if you look, I didn't get into the whole visual part of it, but if you show people a scene versus you show people an object, what you'll find is that to see a scene, you pay attention to the periphery. To see a face, you'll often project those foveolae. And those actual areas of the visual field, you'll see streams of differential fMRI activity from fairly early on. You know, as a memory researcher, anyway, like V4 or something like that, you'll start to see a divergence where you get more medial activation for scene content and more lateral activation for objects and faces. And this proceeds all the way up to the posterior medial and the anterior temporal. So spatial scale seems to be part of it, right? Objects tend to be small, contexts tend to be big. This room's big and people are relatively small by comparison. Temporal scale is also, I think, very important. So people will move. This room isn't going anywhere for a while, right? And so in that sense, temporal scale is important too, or temporal stability. One of the things that I didn't get into is that I'm collaborating with Ken Norman and Sam Gershman, who have a computational model of event representation. And so what their idea is that there's another part of it which has to do with temporal stability, which has to do with the whole idea of these situation models that I've talked about. So Jeff Sachs calls these event models. And so the idea is that we shifted, for instance, we had a transition from my lecture to the question and answer period. And so at some point you registered in your brain, okay, I've got to shift my expectations for what's about to happen. And that changed, something happened at some point where I said, thank you for your attention. And I stopped talking. And you're expecting me, even you're not consciously necessarily expecting that I'm going to, you're aware that at some point I'm going to stop. But once I stop, you get a little prediction error. And that's when you get an event boundary and you change the context. And so the basic idea in the model is the model wants to be able to predict what's coming up next. But it has a bias to retain information about what happened in the past. So in other words, the model wants to assume that there's stability in the world until you reach some point where something has changed or there's something that's violated those predictions enough that you need to change the mental representation. So in this computational framework, basically schemas, as we think about them, schemas are what we're calling this is the knowledge structure that underlies these models that we're talking about. Right? So you have a schema for talks, you have a schema for Q&A period. Now, the schema is functioning as a little prediction machine. So you turn on the schema for talk, and it's generating little predictions about what's likely to happen. And at some point you get a prediction error and you shift and you transition to something else. Now, what makes the schema for an event different than information about an object? There's really potentially very interesting, I mean, I'm no philosopher, but there's potentially very interesting philosophical distinction. To me, one big distinction is that you can have a model of lectures, and the knowledge that underlies lectures can completely generalize across different role fillers. So you come here to your next MTS colloquium, you can have a completely different speaker, completely different content, but your event model is going to be drawing on much the same level of knowledge that you had before. Likewise, even a better example, you go into a cafe, there's some new person working as the barista, but that situational context is so well matched, you probably don't even notice it. You'd probably just be like, at least if you're like me and you're kind of antisocial, you might not even notice who's at the cash register. You just pay and you move on because that's the situation, and it completely generalizes across role fillers. And so we think part of the context representation is a representation that specifies roles and relationships, but is fairly invariant across role fillers. And the role fillers, on the other hand, we think of that as being more in the posterior medial network. So how does the brain figure it out? Well, it's using sensory cues, and it's using the flow of information over time to differentiate that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
So it's kind of different ways of answering the same question.
So kind of a direct follow-up to that. My question has to do with, and it sounds a little bit like you're talking about monitoring and adjusting schemas based on perceived affordances that change across time.
That's right. That's a very compact way of
but I was curious about, with regards to sort of the whole experiment paradigm of looking at events. Are events facts about the brain? So are brains designed to pick up events and detect events and so on and so forth? Or is this something that's a tacit demand, more so than a property of the brain? So is it the fact that we're asking people about events and the fact that we're kind of quizzing them or guiding them through these questions as to detecting beginnings and ends and things like that? Seems to be, at least to some extent, a tacit demand, right? I mean,
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that, the theories that we're working with, and I think the data support this, is, at least, so you think about the PM network, for instance, kind of a great case in point is this guy, Chris Baldessano, who I mentioned earlier. He basically analyzed fMRI data while people watched an entire episode of Sherlock. And forgive me if you guys all know this study. So it's like a long movie, it's like 60 minutes or something in the scanner. And what he did was he applied a machine learning technique called the hidden Markov model. And what he did was basically applied this to just take in patterns of activity from the brain and identify states that are stable across time, and then identify transitions in these neural patterns that happen at particular junctions. And so we fit this model to people's data and then look at it again while people watch the movie again, or while people recall the movie, or while people hear the story about the movie. And what you find is that the same sequence of states and transitions between states occurs across all of these different ways of hearing the story, recalling the story, or just watching the story with no task. It was conserved across subjects as well. And there's another part of this that I'm missing. So, and the most important part is when you look at those state transitions, they tend to agree pretty well with event boundaries that are labeled by people who are being asked to label them. So at least it's not necessary that you should be able to be asked, is there an event boundary to get these kinds of effects, right, in the brain. Now, there's a separate issue as to whether the task that you're doing changes your perception of events. To my knowledge, I can ask Jeff, but to my knowledge that hasn't been studied, but I would be shocked if the answer was no. So for instance, if you were being asked, okay, you're going to have to remember every vocabulary word that I'm using in this talk, your perception of the events would fundamentally change relative to, just look at this guy's shirt or something like that. Or if you're just watching the talk and you have no stake in the matter. We have this all the time. I can watch a talk that's something where I'm not an expert in, and my perception of that talk and my memory for it is completely different than if I'm an expert in that topic. So I don't think that the task demands are irrelevant, but I think events are naturally processed. I think the brain, in general, my suspicion is that the brain in general is a kind of prediction machine at different levels, but that in particular, the PM network is designed to pull out statistical structure in our experiences over time.
Just a minor addendum to that question is it the case that these events are necessarily discrete in any manner, or because it sounds like you're more than amendable to the idea that this is sort of a continuous, we've got possibly different event boundaries depending on how we reassess the situation, things like that, right? So my question is, Alex.
Yeah, I think you asked, so do you see this as an all or none or kind of a continuous phenomenon? The lumping splitting question is kind of empirically and theoretically, it's like, kind of is the glass half lumping, is it half graded or is it half categorical? It's really hard to answer those kinds of questions. The way we're modeling it and the way we're thinking of it, we model them as state transitions, meaning that there's a discrete kind of change. Now you can definitely see one of the things I didn't talk about is we're analyzing some data that came from Cambridge while people were watching movies, and we can see this in our analysis. Ken's lab has shown this in a few studies. At event boundaries, you get a little spike in hippocampal activity. There's also a phenomenon in the hippocampus in rats called remapping, which I didn't talk about. So, for instance, if you had a rat moving around in here, you could record place cells. And as soon as the rat were to go through the door and leave the room, the same place cells that might fire when the animal is here might fire in a completely different place in a different room, even if the geometry of that room is the same. So the place cells aren't just driven by the geometry and the sensory motor information. It's driven by some kind of an internal representation of the context as well. So my guess is that you have a state transition in the PM network that triggers a remapping event in the hippocampus or vice versa. These are discrete. But we can't rule out the graded at all.
Somewhat in line with Morgan's question, I wonder if the film style of the stimuli that are actually being used influences the perception of events. In the sense that most films go from scene.
Yeah.
But then you get single shot. And I'm wondering if people have a different perception of events if the film style is actually different. Because the single shot's more akin to what human experience is like than discrete scene changes.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a great scene from The Shining where he uses the Steadicam and the kid's going through with a big wheel through the house. And that's a classic. Or also Rope, I think, Alfred Hitchcock movie was filmed, I think, in one shot or something like that. So, there are great examples of that. I'm not an event boundary expert, but what I could tell you is that people will rate event boundaries in continuous text when you change the text from being a moment later to a month later or an hour later. You will get a change you will get when you read text and you get like 1 hour later, people are much more likely to rate an event boundary. So there, it's not so much a perceptual change as much as a, mental change in what's going on. Now, your response to this could very well be, well, that's fine, but in a continuous shot, for instance, I might never have that discrete change in my mental representation. The best, and this is totally indirect evidence, but it's kind of cool, so I'll tell you about it anyway. So I was talking to Edvard Moser, who's famous. He won the Nobel Prize for co-won it for finding grid cells. And so he recorded from place cells in the hippocampus. And one of their lab's findings was in the anterior hippocampus, or ventral hippocampus in the rat, people used to say, well, you don't get place cells there for some reason. And so people just didn't talk about it. They just recorded from the dorsal hippocampus. But what they showed was, in fact, if you have a really long room and you have an animal run across the track, you get place cells in the ventral hippocampus. They're just really large, and so they'll encompass half the room. And so in a smaller room, the place cell might encompass the whole room, right? Interestingly, the only way they could get that effect, though, is in a gigantic room. So if you had the animal walk through, so initially they did the experiment where the track ran through multiple rooms, and every time the animal would go through a doorway, you get remapping in the hippocampus. Gabe Radvansky has done similar kind of work. He has this phenomenon called forgetting occurs when you go through, or walking through doorways causes forgetting. And so it's kind of an experimental analog of the phenomena that many of us have, especially as we get older, where you get up off the couch, you go to the kitchen to get something, and by the time you get there, you have no idea what it is you went to the kitchen for in the first place. And you end up grabbing junk food instead of whatever it is you're supposed to get. So there does seem to be, even in continuous experiences, some kind of event shifts that take place. So whether or not you can get a graded change in a mental representation, I think the answer to some of the graded versus categorical is, events, within an event, you never have complete stability, right? In other words, you can have the lecture event, or you can have the first stage of making pancakes where you're beating the eggs. Everything is changing. It's not like a subject thinks, nothing is changing during that time. So there is a continuity, but then at some point you shift from beating the eggs to adding flour or something like that. You go, okay, something fundamental has changed. So the way we are computationally modeling this is that you have kind of one sub-recurrent neural network, or one subsection, let's say. You could think of it in the brain as one subpopulation of neurons where information is cycling through during this event. But then when you hit an event boundary, you hit a completely different population of neurons that's largely non-overlapping. So I think there's continuity within an event, and when you hit an event boundary, that's by definition some kind of a mental discontinuity. Back.
The practice of building or using memory palaces seems like an interesting way to break out like the who, what, when, especially where and how categories. As far as encoding and decoding information, is that something that you or people do with this sort of research?
It's really funny because my collaborators, Jeff Zaks and Ken Norman, could have given you a talk that you guys would have enjoyed much more than mine. So we're all working on this big grant. So we just had like a big meeting that I hosted it was a dog and pony show for the program officers. And so we all showed our new data for this grant. And so actually Ken and Chris Baldessano have a study where they've looked at memory experts so they scanned a memory expert while he's using this memory palace technique. So people who are like, these kind of memory athletes and stuff like that, or they teach mnemonic devices, they actually will teach people they'll use this memory palace technique where they go, I imagine, and this guy would actually it was more the method of loci, but basically he would say, I imagine this route that I would walk where I grew up. And in this place, I would visualize some cue that would tell me about this thing in this place, and then I'd visualize some cue that would tell me about this place, so forth. And so he imagined a mental trajectory that was a sequence in both space and time. So if you think about it in 4 dimensions, it's like moving through the space. And so he would like create this memory palace that way. And so the guy would be recalling information, that would just be items on a list. And basically, they could use the hidden Markov model to track the state transitions and predict when he would be, actually, so he was out loud saying how he was using his movement through the memory palace to guide his recall. And as he was recalling it, you could track in real time, okay, here's a shift where he's gone from one location to the next. And here's where he's gone from one location to the next. And it was all happening in the PM network. And these aren't happening everywhere. They do happen in a lot of places, but the PM network shows up time and time again. So it's totally relevant exactly for the reason that you mentioned. One of my former undergrads had done some work where she was looking at something like the method of loci and memory palaces, but instead of using space, she used the steps in making a sandwich. So it was a temporal sequence of events. And she was able to get effects that were very similar to using a method of loci technique. So sequences and space seem to be both very usable for that role. I'll just go to new people. So
so one of the things like what you're just saying there kind of reminded me that the method of loci and memory palaces and all that kind of stuff seem to just provide some of that structure, right? So you can use your PM network the way you were talking about, and it'll have structure to use and encode the events or whatever. And I was wondering if in the final experiment you had there, where you have the incoherent facts and the coherent versions of the story, I was wondering is there a version of that experiment, or do you do anything to keep people from trying to come up with a story that connects it to incoherent facts, right? So if they're doing that themselves, then they're sort of doing another numerical device, right? Or not a mnemonic device.
It's a great question. So there's actually like a study that my colleague Christian Dohler did. So they didn't look at this kind of memory consolidation thing, but what they did was they showed people kind of like two really boring VR movies, and then they showed one like little scene that would allow them to link it all into a specific narrative. So it's along the lines of, it's not quite making up a story, but they fed them some information that allowed them after the fact to put it all together. And what they found was, if you had that little chunk of video footage later on that allowed you to make sense of the two video pieces, you get more pattern similarity in the hippocampus than if you didn't. So I think that absolutely, like if you could make up some story, I would be, it's a great experiment to do. I might borrow this idea and see, but if you could make up a story to link these two things into a larger narrative, I would imagine you would get exactly those effects. So it's a very testable hypothesis. We haven't done it yet.
I was wondering about how false memories may or may not produce activation in the posterior medial, since a lot of them seem to be contextually related. In the example earlier, you misremembered hospital, which is contextually related to Homer being really sick from eating, day-old, weeks-old mayonnaise kind of thing. So what's the relationship here to this model of memory and falsely recalling semantically, contextually appropriate? So
that's a great question. So, actually a lot of the, if you go back and you look at Beth Loftus was really famous for doing work on kind of, memory errors. And one of the things that she used to do was she would ask people, she would have people watch a movie, then one day later ask them misleading questions about that. And then 1 week later bring them back to the lab, and they would incorporate that information from the questions into their recollection. It's exactly the same structure as what we were using to enhance memory, and she was producing memory distortions. And in fact, Bryce Kuhl did an experiment that just came out, I think it's cerebral cortex, and it's very much like our spillover experiment, except they used a design that was designed to encourage people to make misattributions and memory monitoring errors. And it turns out doing that retrieval practice actually messed people up into they retrieved more information about the event if they did retrieval practice, but they also retrieved a lot of stuff that was incorrect as well. So basically, and the degree to which they reinstated the context, I think, was kind of giving them more of an error or something like that. So I think there's multiple answers. So one part of it is definitely the act of retrieval can both give you more memory distortions as well as, and this is related to like work that's been done on schemas for a long time. Bartlett did this work too. But there's another kind of, the theory part of it, which is how does this happen how can you come up with a mechanistic model for explaining it? And one of the cool things about this line of work is, we haven't done it yet, but the coolest thing to me is that we're not saying memory lives in the hippocampus. We're saying memory largely lives in these specific trajectories of activity in the PM network. And what the PM network is representing, though, is these statistical patterns. So like, you can imagine that on the one hand, you might get a particular trajectory of activity through the network during this event, but there's sort of well-worn tracks so that similar events will be likely to bleed over into each other and spill over into each other. And so in this model, and in our spillover data, that's exactly what we seem to see, is the hippocampus seems to be pulling you up to get to that beginning part, get to part of the event. But then the PM network can fall on its own statistics and sort of unfold the event and reconstruct it possibly on its own. I mean, I'm anthropomorphizing the brain here, so I don't actually think that PM network's saying, But the point is that basically our model is suggesting that the PM network is capturing these statistical regularities. And like you said, a big statistical regularity is you watch a movie about somebody getting clinically sick. It makes perfect sense to predict that a hospital scene is going to come up. And if you generate that prediction, you'd be likely to then incorporate into your recollections later on through these kinds of reconsolidation or memory updating processes that we're talking about. So I think it definitely fits in. And the very kinds of event structures we're talking about that give you benefits in memory surely also lead to reconstructive errors as well. I think you had a question for?
Oh, yes. Has anybody actually modeled like the topology of these different event series, whether there's some sort of behavioral score or some sort of neural response, like the voxel sort of score that you were mentioning?
Sorry, can you explain a little bit further so I don't answer the wrong question?
Right, so for example, like let's say that you have an experiment or multiple experiments where you have these sort of like either neural or behavioral responses that you get some sort of score, right, per scene. And then you can look at the different, if there's enough resolution to those responses and the amount of scenes that you're looking at, you get some sort of like situation, similar to the situation model, you can get enough resolution so that you can look at maybe model the topology between those different events.
Yeah, well, so by model the topology, you're thinking like you can decode the events, like that's
Right.
your, so you can definitely do that. And so in fact, that's what the hidden Markov model
Right.
is designed to do. And so you can actually pull out that structure across different modalities of experiencing the same thing. But there's kind of an added level of analysis that there's a new preprint from, actually it's my former undergraduate, or my former research assistant, who's now a postdoc at Dartmouth. And so him and Jeremy Manning have this really cool method. It's like an approach to identifying trajectories of movement in multidimensional data. And so basically it can be applied to anything. So what they did was they took that Sherlock data that I told you about, the Chris Baldessano model, but rather than modeling the event transitions, they looked for the trajectory of information in the Sherlock episode. So what they did was first of all, they just used a text analysis, and they developed, I guess these use these, it was kind of like an engineer does literature. It was like they used these things called wordles to sort of like pull together a multi-dimensional space of the words and then mapped out through some, I'm gonna have Andy come back and explain this all to me, but they sort of map out a trajectory of movement through this semantic space as like the movie itself. And then they look for brain regions where the activity patterns map on to the movement within that space. And they find that the hippocampus is one of the regions that shows up. So interestingly, the hippocampus doesn't show these stable activity pattern transitions that Ken and Chris were looking for, but it was showing unique trajectories of activity within those events. And so, again, this gets back to this idea of a hierarchy of kind of, here's the context, and here's the specific people and things you're seeing in the sequence of information that's unfolding within this larger event structure. And so it looks like, you have to see the preprint, but my memory is that also kind of is recapitulated when people recall the events and so forth. You definitely see the topology of movement through the semantic space recapitulated during recall.
So talking about these statistical pathways kind of burned into our brains in terms of scenes that we're familiar with, do you think something related to that is going on when you get older and start doing this thing where you walk into a room and don't remember what it was you were going to get? Like we're so on automatic in our movement through space that the encoding of the details isn't happening. Or how would you explain that? Because it's funny that all of us have that experience.
Yeah, so I mean, my thinking is that almost everyone, I mean, it's kind of a circular thing because it's sort of like saying, well, almost everyone will experience an event boundary when you cross through that doorway. But that's just a redescription of the phenomena that we're talking about, that you tend to forget about everything that was happening right before. So something, clearly sensory information changing is one big cue that we have to these changes in event representation. But there's also kind of other kinds of prediction errors. We talked about this higher level knowledge level that can drive it. I think your question though is about aging, is that right? Yeah, so aging is an interesting one. So my postdoc Zach, one of the many projects he's working on is he's analyzing this data set that came from, it was done by my colleagues at Cambridge, where they scanned a ton of older people and younger people while they were watching a movie. And one of the things he's finding is that if you look at basically the state transitions in the PM network, what he's finding is that there's a fairly linear change, so that if I remember correct, and I might have to send an apology email from, like if Zach tells me this is wrong, but if I remember correctly, what he's finding is analyses, is that as people get older, the degree to which those state transitions map on to what young people will go, this is an event boundary, actually decreases. So what's likely, I don't want to overinterpret this data because we haven't had enough time to pore over it. What's likely taking place is that you're getting more instability in the event boundaries, which gets back to your idea of kind of like, I went off into outer space and started thinking about what I'm going to do next week. I pulled out my iPhone and I started to look. I got texted while I was doing something. So multitasking is probably going to massively screw up all this stuff, right? Technology is totally going to mess up everything, So I think that there are many factors that can contribute to this, and certainly distraction is a big one. But I think people focus on distraction as being like, I'm not doing the task that I'm supposed to be doing. But it actually is working at this much larger level of my event cognition is getting screwed up, and that can have all sorts of interesting fun effects on it.
Okay, let's, can you ask him after? I'm sorry. I don't want to prevent anyone from leaving who wants to leave. Thank you very much for your talk.